I'm here today to speak about equitability and accessibility of book content, and I talked about opening the ebooks. It is quite a wide-ranging talk, so there's quite a lot to get through, so please do save your questions and ask them at the end, or interrupt if you really need to. So when I was starting to do this, I was starting to think about what does accessibility and equitability mean. And last week I was at a UCL conference on accessibility, and the accessibility manager of Taylor & Francis, Stacey Scott, made a statement there that said accessibility is the stepping stone to inclusion. And it really struck a chord with me that accessibility isn't the end goal. Accessibility is just a stepping stone. It's just part of the way we go to the ultimate goal of inclusion, whereby everybody can achieve their full potential and be included in society, and particularly in education at their full potential, because we've made everything equitable and accessible so that they can engage wherever they need to be and however they need to engage. And then equitability, it's a bit more of a challenging term, so I've done some Googling around what that term might mean, and this statement came up, which I'm sure you can all read on there. It was just from somebody on the internet talking about how equitability is also a step, and it needs to go one step further in terms of justice, that we can fix the systems that are broken, that have held people back for so long, and hopefully we'll change those systems sufficiently that future generations don't have to go through this, and everybody will just be, everything will be equitable so that everybody can achieve their full potential. So why do we as librarians care about this? Well, these are the CILIP ethical principles, and they explicitly talk about equitable treatment of users and colleagues within as librarians, but they also talk about the continuity of access and freedom from censorship, or, and I've taken censorship to mean not just choosing which resources we don't put in our collections, but how we stop people from accessing certain things, and how we can bring in inappropriate bias by accident almost if we're not making everything accessible. And the American ALA principles are very similar. So we as librarians have this as our core of our principles of what we want to do as librarians. And then I looked at what do students want. And students just want choice. Students want to be able to access what they want, when they want it, in a way that's right for them. So for some users with additional needs, that's going to be things that aren't too heavy, things that they can change, so they can change the backgrounds and the colours, so they can make text bigger, so they can have text read aloud to them. And that might not be because of a specific disability. That might be because of, at the end of the day, their eyes are tired. It might be because they can't get to the library that day because the trains are on strike, or it could be because they've got a specific additional need whereby those things are integral to how they're going to access their e-resources. But this was a quote from a study that Cambridge College Libraries did last year, just after the end of the main lockdowns, to see whether students had moved on and whether ebooks were now all they wanted, or whether, and after 2 years of not being able to get to the print copies, whether they didn't want them anymore. And it found that students really wanted choice, that for some people print suited them really well, others ebooks suited them well, and a lot of people wanted both and be able to choose. So just setting this a little bit of where I'm from. So I'm from Edge Hill University. We're a modern university in the northwest of England. So I'm talking very much from a UK perspective here. We're a moderately sized university, around 14,000 students, mostly undergraduate, but our postgraduate and our PhD programs are growing, and our research is a key area that we're growing to increase our impact in the UK. We're originally a teacher training college, so we've got a large faculty of education. We train a lot of teachers, but we've also got a large health faculty. We train a lot of nurses, and we've also now got a medical school. Our faculty of arts and science is quite varied. So we've got some STEM, but quite small numbers, but also a lot of art subjects across a variety of things. And the research there is also becoming increasingly important. The library service here is in the modern Catalyst building. So there's an image on screen there. It's a 2-storey building, very large, with a lovely roof garden when you can get out if the weather's nice enough. And if you saw my background previously, and you'll see it at the end, that's actually inside the Catalyst building. You see it's light and airy and designed to encourage study, but also collaborative study. We've been 4th place nationally in the NSS scores for library resources last year. We were really, really proud of that. that we are serving our students, and we've worked really hard to get there, and BibliU have helped us in getting there and making sure that students had access to the resources they needed. And where we were just before COVID, we were just starting to implement our eFirst policy. We were just in the final stages of developing it and consulting on it when the pandemic struck. So that's just a bit about Edge Hill Library Services there. And obviously I'm here today with BibliU, and they've also got this audacious vision for learning. This is off their website, of their mission statement, of wanting to ensure that students can have access to their content in a way that's equitable and effective and efficient. And that's partly why we engaged with BibliU when we came to be providing e-textbooks. So back in time, going back a long way, when print books were the main way of students accessing information from the library, there was a huge imbalance there. Students were expected to buy their own textbooks. So if you had the money to buy that print book, you were at the top of the seesaw. You had full access to that text whenever and wherever you needed it, and you could just get on with your studies. If you didn't have that money to buy those textbooks for whatever reason, I mean, I remember when I was at university, I had a grant. It was a very small one. It was just as student loans were coming in, and the grant didn't go very far, but I was still expected to buy these books. So if you couldn't afford those books, you were reliant on the library, and textbooks were often very restricted. They might be reference only, or they might be on short-term loans, things like that, which meant you were really restricted about when and where you could study. You might be forced to study in the library. Or you might have to buy a second-hand copy that may have been out of date. So you were kind of the sliding scale down the seaside, but things were weighted against you already, and it wasn't very accessible. If you had additional needs, you probably weren't even getting on the seesaw at all. Alternative formats were really hard and expensive to come by. You had to go through a lot of hoops to get them. You had to declare a lot of things, and often that would just preclude you entirely from being accessible and engaging with the learning. Over time, there's been a lot of disruption. The internet has brought huge changes to how we can access things. There's an expectation that we can get everything where and when we want it. And it's really changed students and staff's expectations of where information is going to be and how it's going to be. And it's opened up choice hugely. There's also been changes in the UK market with the introduction of student loans, and there's a different expectation now from students that the resources they need to complete their degree will be available to them and included as part of that money they paid for their degree in the form of a student loan. And so there's a lot of campaigns and things around exposing hidden costs, and e-textbooks and textbooks in general are often included in that. So lots of universities are looking at ways of making those resources available to students, and different ways of managing that, either through the library or through different schemes. And of course, accessibility is now enshrined in law, so is now no longer a requirement of people to fight to have things made accessible, although I'm not saying that doesn't still happen and there's not still lots of barriers there, but the ability to be able to find accessible formats is enshrined in law, and we as libraries are now expected to make those resources available in ways that can be made more accessible to students with additional needs.
Sorry, Ruth, I think we've got a question from Catherine.
Okay.
Catherine, do you want to, I think you raised your hand if you want to pop your question, or so we can, if you want to put in the chat as well.
If it's in the chat, can you read it out, please, Etienne?
Yeah, no, I think we are.
I'm so sorry, I must have pressed the button by mistake. Just ignore that.
No problem, thanks, Catherine. Sorry, Ruth.
Okay, no problem, please. Thank you. Okay, so at Edge Hill pre-2020, and continuing from that, our acquisitions are driven by reading lists. Academics put the text they want onto their reading list, then those lists come to my team in the collections and archives team, and we purchase and make available books based and text in general based on those reading lists. Pre-2020, our purchasing model was bent on print and formulas used by student numbers. We were starting to grow our ebook collection through direct purchase, and also through some subscription packages. And we were starting to experiment with demand-driven acquisition, DDA, whereby we put books into our catalogue, but they're only purchased when the student engages with that text, which is a really useful thing to get from ebooks that we can do that because you don't have to kind of put the book on your shelf and buy it up front. Accessibility was mostly done by students declaring a need and making a request. So we use digitization and platforms such as Bookshare, etc., to facilitate accessibility. And then, of course, we had the global pandemic, and that really messed up our print-based acquisition. So we were already starting to move to an e-first policy, but the pandemic meant our entire Catalyst, our beautiful Catalyst building, was shut down completely for about 6 months, and then with very restricted access for a good period of time after that. So obviously, ebooks should be the heroes and come to the rescue. They offer huge advantages in accessibility. So they can read things aloud for you if the platform's correct, as things like BibliU are. They can read aloud, you can change the colours, you can change the font size, you don't have to carry around a lot of heavy books, you don't have to hold them up if you've got arthritis or other conditions that might affect how you can hold things. And if you're suffering from social anxiety, you don't have to go into a busy library, you can just get it at home and access it. And obviously in the pandemic, that was a huge advantage. They were available when and where we needed them. And there's also additional tools in there that you can add notes, you can highlight, you can share, you can discuss parts with tutors and with fellow students to help and deepen your understanding. But as many people found during the pandemic, the devil was in the detail, that the digital divide came to the fore, that not everybody had devices that could access all the resources that they needed. Libraries had to work hard to try and provide those devices. Digital rights management on ebooks and e-text was often a huge barrier, requiring people to log in multiple times, to download additional software, and that software often contraindicated with the accessibility features. So people using screen reading software often couldn't engage with things that were using DRM based systems. For libraries, we also found that ebooks were moving to e-textbook models. It appeared a little bit at random as publishers just decided to change their things. Prices fluctuated overnight and went up unexpectedly. And there was also the issue of older books, which were just not available as e-textbooks, and other publishers who just retained just a print model and didn't make text available as ebooks. So although ebooks promised the future, there were a lot of problems along the way that were uncovered really in the pandemic. At Edge Hill, when the pandemic hit, we experimented with a lot of the free content that was made available. So lots of publishers across the board in journals and ebooks made some content available freely. The aggregators, BibliU and their competitors, made various content available to us, and we engaged with that to see how the systems worked and to try different things out. We realised that come September, the world was not going to be back to where it was pre-2020. So we realised we were going to need to put in a funding case for e-textbooks. We put that in to our finance. They did give us some extra money, but they also asked us to try and use the savings made from the print budget to cover that. So obviously we then had a reduced print budget, which had knock-ons come post the pandemic. So there were various models looked at when we were moving to an e-textbook model to give access to a wide variety of text. The one that was put forward by quite a number of suppliers was a one-to-one model, whereby we'd select one textbook per module and ensure that everybody had access to that textbook. That was a huge initial outlay, and it was money that we just simply didn't have at Edge Hill. And it also required a lot of buy-in with academics to choose that core text, which at that point in time, in sort of September 2020, academics were busy trying to completely change the way they taught at Edge Hill. And learning lots of new systems to put courses and lectures and assessments completely online. And they didn't necessarily have the time to engage with us and choose and supply and send back to us what that one core text was for each module. And at Edge Hill, we've also got a lot of arts courses that don't really work from a textbook model. They work on a wide reading across the subject, and this model didn't really fit with that. So we decided not to go down that model at all. And instead, we decided to work with BibliU. We'd been impressed with them when we'd worked with them in the early days of the pandemic. And we'd also done a small pilot with them prior to the pandemic. We had three e-textbooks for two different departments. prior to the pandemic, so we'd seen how the system worked. We knew that students enjoyed the platform, and so we engaged with BibliU. BibliU gave us flexibility of how we purchase text, and we used their user-activated acquisitions model, the UAA model, and we put about 150 titles into that at the start of the pandemic, which meant that we only paid for that seat, so that it's on a one-to-one model for students. So one student has one textbook for 1 year, but we only paid for that seat for that textbook when the student engaged with that textbook. We also had a separate package of Sage titles, which we negotiated directly with Sage, but was hosted on the BibliU platform for about another 150 titles, where we paid up front, and so students just had access to those titles on their modules. That was particularly for our education department and some of our nursing courses, where the Sage titles were really important. And we ran with that for the first year. There were some bumps along the way because it was the pandemic and everybody was learning what was happening, but we were really pleased. We got the setup done really quickly. So those books were available to our students from, I think we got the majority there for mid-October. And I think by November we had most of those titles ready, which really, really helped smooth that first time of the pandemic when things were getting locked down at different times, and people were coming and going, and people could be on campus and weren't, and were having to isolate and things like that. When it came to the renewals, we did notice a few problems from the publishers. This wasn't BibliU's fault, this was to do with publishers. Pricing changed significantly for some titles. So some titles we had went up significantly. A couple did go down, but some of them went up. They were just, the price increases appeared to be random. There was no consistency of price increases. We also found some publishers had withdrawn their titles from the UAA model, so we couldn't have them in that model. We either had to choose to purchase up front or not have access to that title any longer. And we had also realised that it had cost us a bit too much money, and we had to reduce the number of titles in the UAA and make it much more focused, which obviously meant that some departments lost out on some titles. And we did have one problem that a publisher tried to change the access partway through the year. BibliU intervened and negotiated for us on that, and we didn't lose that access. But that was one of the things that we were trying to do with the textbook model, which we were worried about happening, was that we'd make a title available at the start of the year, and a student who was very engaged might have access and they might have secured their seat. But if we had to withdraw that partway through the year, another student who may have had family difficulties or other reasons why they couldn't engage in the course early on, or who just simply, left it to the last minute, would not have access to that same resource. And we didn't want that kind of inequitable playing field for our students either. And that has been a worry as we've been going along with publishers of textbooks. And we could use the stats supplied by BibliU. There's excellent stats in the back end of BibliU to see what's going on, who's using which titles, how much they're being accessed. So we could base our renewals based on that, on real data of how things were being used. But the pandemic did expose all of these problems, some of which I've talked about already in the ebook and the e-textbook market. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the hashtag #EbookSOS, the campaign started by 3 librarians to really bring these problems to the fore and talk about the inequitable purchasing models that are being offered to libraries, how we've got so little choice. Sometimes we're forced down certain routes, sometimes we're forced to buy packages to have access to books. And although BibliU worked really hard, there's still publishers who don't want to engage. So all these problems have been explained. There's some really good, I've got a bibliography at the end of this presentation. There's a few really nice explanations of the problems. There's a new paper by Don Broadhurst, Ruth Dale and Jason Harper that goes through it all in quite a lot of detail. The ebookSOS website is really useful, and Bath Uni also did a recent blog post that's really quick and easy guide to some of the problems for staff and students. And it's just kind of showing that from that initial seesaw we had with the print model, where students were expected to buy the books, and some had the large purchasing power and could do that and others didn't. We've just kind of moved that onto the size of library budgets and to the spending power of individual universities. So the accessibility and equitability of these things has just been moved rather than being solved. And we also have the thing that students still want choice of ebooks and print. So libraries are getting expected to pay out in both ways, in ways that we weren't before the pandemic, so to providing print and access to these books. So what were the positives of us moving to our e-textbook model? It was really appreciated by staff and students. Our NSS scores reflect that students, even during the pandemic when we were locked down, were still able to access their e-resources. Students really liked the BibliU platform, and one particular sight-impaired student said that the BibliU platform was their favourite, and could we get all our books on BibliU, because it really worked for them, that they could have the text. It worked with their preferred screen readers. We weren't forcing them down a platform, they could read the text. And I know other students like it because they can change the text size, they can change the colours, they can use all those normal accessibility features that are there within the BibliU platform, and they like being able to engage with others. And we've seen some really good work with some tutors who've really used the integration facilities on BibliU to really impact their learning and teaching. But do we have some concerns going forward? And yes, we do. So we're still worried that titles are getting removed from the BibliU offer, that titles are changing, and that prices are changing, and we've still got problems over older titles that aren't available in BibliU, and which publishers won't engage with BibliU to try and get for us. We do have some issues about the rented nature of the e-textbook model. We don't own this content. Libraries like to have their collections and like to own it and know what they're doing with it, and we're now moving to a rented version of that, which is it's different for librarians, and we need to get to grips with that, but it somehow doesn't feel right, and we'd like to be able to have the option to own some of the content. And we do worry about that when we're looking at user metrics, we're missing some of the smaller courses, that larger courses obviously have the larger usage and maybe shouting loudest, and we're still missing out on making that complete, equitable, accessible thing for all our students, and not just the ones who are on the big courses and make a lot of noise. And there's been some research about ebooks hindering academic success, that students just get into the habit of just dipping in for the last little bit, which maybe they always have done, but now maybe we've got evidence on it, rather than reading the full text and getting that wider perspective. I'm not sure about that. I think there's pros and cons on it, and I think the pros probably massively outweigh the cons, but it is changing the way that students engage with their academic text, and I think there's no doubt about that, really. And so looking at how that feeds back into teaching and learning. So at Edge Hill, are we getting it right? No, we don't think we are yet. We've come a long way, and BibliU has been really helpful in us getting to where we are. It offers us accessibility, as I said, that's really useful for the students on the text that we've got, but we're still only quite a small collection. We know it's still variable by subject, and our staff are still needing education in how to make their resources truly accessible, how to check in with us that a text is going to be available, and we can make it available as and as print copies before they add it to a reading list, particularly if it's a reading list that they're going to tell everybody to look at the same time or use in a exam situation or something, because a lot of these titles, not necessarily on BibliU, but on other platforms, are still on restricted licenses for 1, 2, or 3 users rather than fully open access. Not open access, sorry, I'm using the wrong term there, really. So fully accessible by a large number of people at the same time access. And to get fully accessible titles, students too often still have to ask for the help and declare issues and come and ask. We're not managing to get that baseline where everything's accessible just at the point of need. Students still have to make various declarations and ask for help too often. So what's next for Edge Hill? We will be continuing to work with BibliU. We do continue to buy print, albeit in less numbers now. We're closely monitoring our usage and data and value for money. We do use stats in BibliU and in other partners that we work with to make sure that we're getting the right text where we can and the best value for money. We are aware that we're hoping to develop some more STEM courses at Edge Hill, and that is going to have a huge impact on our figures, because we are aware that a lot of the titles that we would need for that are going to cost a lot more, and that may have protected us up to now, that Edge Hill hasn't needed those STEM courses quite in the same way that other universities have. And as we're going forward, we're trying to flag that early to the people who are making the decisions at the top of the university, that these courses will cost a lot to resource from the library, and if they want to continue with that same level of accessibility and equitable access, we're going to have to spend a lot of money. And we're also looking at the implication of currency fluctuations and inflation and how that's going to affect our budget and how we might have to reduce our spending on new things, but potentially within our existing collection to manage those figures. And then for the sector, there's quite a lot coming up. So I've already talked about some of the work being done by eBook SOS and other articles around how we can reform the ebook and e-textbook market to offer, while maintaining a secure market, because I don't think anybody wants to see another publisher go out of business or anything like that. But we want to make it equitable for libraries so that we have some choice over the models we're purchasing on, and also to have more predictable pricing so that we can plan our budgets a bit more. And we're also looking at controlled digital lending, not really a subject I want to go into today, but whereby if you've got a print copy, you can digitize it, take that print copy off the shelf, but then lend that out as an ebook instead. It's another option of making our collection more accessible and giving more equitable access to that collection. We'd like to see more accessibility as the norm, with consistency across platforms, so that students, as I said, they get an excellent experience at BibliU mostly, but even at BibliU, if the publishers have provided PDF versions of their books as against EPUB versions of the book, there's still not consistency between that experience that students have when they're trying to use the accessibility features such as screen readers and other things, and we'd like to see more consistency across different platforms for that. The sector is also starting to look at open educational resources to get around the publishers and the costs, and how we can work together as universities to maybe look at open access textbooks, but I think that's a longer, slower burn. And raising awareness with academics, so when they're planning reading lists for e-resources, and also when they're as authors, to making sure that the things they're writing are available back to libraries in ways that are accessible. What we don't want is our academics writing a textbook that we can't then afford or we can't access on a suitable model to make available to their students. And then one final little thing that's kind of a coming storm, I think, that's going to be gaining some traction over the coming days is the data. So I've already mentioned there's a lot of data in the back of BibliU, and we're really pleased with that and we like to use it. But as a sector across different platforms, and we've already seen this over the summer with Wiley, they suddenly found out about how much use was happening to some of the titles in one of the academic subscriptions for ebooks, and then suddenly tried to sell us back that data, that same books, for a lot more money by taking them out of that package and putting them onto an e-textbook model. It's not happened yet. It's kind of got pushed back down the line, but it's still coming, and it's based on the data, and we're paying for these resources, and then the data is being collected, and we're not sure exactly how that's being used, how that's being packaged back. And sometimes it's being packaged back to universities from some providers in ways saying, we'll sell it back to you for your to track students' usage and for educational tracking. So there's lots going on with the data that's behind there about how it's being used and how it's being used by the market to look for future ways, in ways that we've never done with a print book. We'd never have let a publisher come in and see how their books are actually being used by students and watch the students in a print environment. So I think that's coming, and Anthony Sinnott and Caroline Ball have written a paper on that, and it's linked in my bibliography as well. So it's not particularly relevant for today, but it is a coming thing for the sector on the accessibility and the use of e-textbooks. And that is it from me. So thank you for listening.